I suppose firstly, Bordemona is a utility, but it's a state-owned entity. And there are opportunities with regard to state spend. The state, I think, through its public procurement spends nearly 10 billion euros a year. So I was asked to, I sort of suggested two potential subjects for doing this. One was a nice fancy one with supply chain diagrams and explain some of the challenges facing us, and the other was, which I found really hard, is to get on the other side of the table and try and advise suppliers on how to influence people like me, how to get around people like me, and also maybe to do the same with regard to the public sector, which is slightly different from the utility sector. So it's to understand the different sectors and to maybe give some practical tips on how to get in there and maybe sell your goods and services. The first thing I look at is there's some very practical stuff in this, but a lot of it is from experience that I've seen over the years where people have made some very basic mistakes, right? Read your tender documentation very carefully. I mean, I have simple stuff up there. What dates do I have to comply with? You'll be amazed how many people don't look at the likes of what I have to do and by what time, etc. What process? As a utility, we will always use a negotiated tendering process. You've got to understand that it's not available, or it's very limited, in very limited circumstances available to most public sector companies. So you really have to look and understand, is this an open public tender, or is this something that I'll have an opportunity to go in and negotiate, or maybe to say a bit more about what my potential is? A lot of the time in an open public competition, you won't get that chance. So you got to look through the tender documentation, get a very clear understanding of what process is being used. How do I seek clarifications? There's going to be something there that says, if I don't understand what is required in this tender, if I don't understand what value I'm supposed to add, how am I supposed to make a valuable submission? Is this an OJU competition? For example, if I take Bordemona, about 25% of our spend is subject to the Utilities Directive, the rest isn't. Right? So we have restrictions in terms of the Utilities Directive. The public sector has a lot more restrictions, but you've got to get some basic understanding of what that imposes in terms of a supplier complying in a competition. Take particular note of pre-qual and award criteria. I suppose the first thing, why waste a whole load of effort on something where you really are not going to qualify? If it's for a piece of work that is way outside of your capacity or experience, what you've done in the past, I'll advise maybe a strategy to deal with that, but I don't think you should waste your time. And have a clear understanding if you're going to qualify, if there's a pre-qualification set of criteria there. Again, also understand that they have to be fair and proportionate. They can't be made up just to sort of push somebody out of a competition. If they're related to the actual competition itself, and if they're proportionate, etc., that's what they have to be. So if I was sitting on the supply side, I'd be looking very clearly at what is being put forward here from a pre-qual position. Look at the weightings of criteria. I mean, again, if something is 75% price and it's 15% in sort of value-added areas, it's clearly going to be a lowest price type of award. So just, again, have a look at the weightings and be conscious of them. Early engagement. Now this, I think a lot of people would conclude that this isn't really as available as it might be in terms of the public sector. But if this is something that's recurring, if it's a spend within the public sector that's recurring, that means that even while there's a current competition, a current supplier in place, there's nothing to stop any supplier going in there and saying, who's the functional owner, who's the competition runner for this particular requirement? When is it coming up again? What do you find good about your current supply situation? What are you missing? Is there any value that can be added? And you can get in there at a very early stage. So meet with the procurement people, meet with functional spend owners in advance of competitions, even while another supplier is in there, if you want to get the opportunity to try and get in and influence the requirement. If you've got a particular valuable solution and you don't get an option to put that forward and to influence the parties who are going to try and write up a specification of what they want, they may not include the value that you're capable of adding in terms of what they put out in public and they run the competition. Again, if your offering is not the lowest cost one and you're looking at total cost of ownership, etc., you've got to go in and sell that proposition to people who are probably, from a public procurement perspective, you're going to see all sorts of nice things here about supply chains. They're actually going to be in an environment where they're probably afraid to make mistakes in the current environment rather than necessarily looking to get out and do all sorts of collaborative supply chain work with partners. They're going to be much more afraid that they're going to make a mistake and that they're going to be held to account for it, etc. And so it's a difficult environment from their perspective as well. So what I would suggest is if you do get the opportunity, get in there, sort of explain the value adds, explain what your solution is able to do compared to what they're currently doing or what you could potentially add in terms of value. And don't necessarily wait until there's a competition coming around until you do that. This is a very simple little thing. Proofread your documentation prior to submission. I couldn't tell you, I wouldn't be able to list on my two hands the number of times over the years where a supplier has used generic documentation and hasn't replaced somebody else's name. So when I get a tender and it says, we think ESB are the greatest and we want to supply you with stuff, and I say, well, we're not ESB, but I'll pass on your good wishes, etc. It happens frequently, right? So it is a case of, search your Word document, search through it and look for all references and change them, because I don't know how many times that has happened. One thing I'd hear to say is highlight your continuous improvement capability and bring that agenda to the public sector. Because if you're bringing in something that, again, influences and says, I can make this better and better and better the whole time, well, then you might get somebody in terms of designing a competition or putting a tender document together to say, I will actually put in something for added value or continuous improvement, and I'll rate that and score it and judge it. So again, if you bring it to someone's attention as a value add, it's very hard for somebody from a public sector perspective to ignore that potential. So if you bring it and you say, this is where my industry is going, this is how I can add value and I can bring value to the public sector, can you please take account of it the next time you're going to do something? I think there's huge potential there, And I'd say hooks to deliver future value. I mean, you're sort of, it's a bit like fishing, you're putting in there. If you can hook something that says, it's not as easy to push you out because you said that if I get the opportunity to continually engage, I can continue to add value. Now, that's a very hard argument for anyone to ignore. Collaborate with others to enhance scale and scope. You frequently hear the whole sort of SME angle about smaller suppliers and big public contracts. If it's somewhere close to 10 billion euros, and it's the argument often is that big companies get this, but look, smaller companies can get together and increase scale and scope capacity, and again, where the scale is required, I would say I much prefer to see indigenous industry or businesses winning contracts. So if parties that are Irish-based or whatever are able to get together and make proposals, I mean, I would say there's genuinely an openness to that as well. Pursue opportunities where you have delivery capability. Again, don't waste your time, because ultimately, and I've found parties who are not capable and they'll struggle and they say, please bring me to the next stage and the next stage, and I want to keep in there. If it's not for you, pursue something else that is for you, because ultimately you'll put an awful lot of effort in there and you could end up wasting potential effort that you could dedicate to something where you could actually add value. Constructively seek feedback to improve future performance. I can remember one time we ran a particular complex engineering consultancy, and a particular party was unsuccessful and said, can we come in and meet for a debriefing? So I said, fine. And where my office is, I can see the car park outside the window. And I saw a range of, we'll say, cars that looked like we were dealing with all of the directors in the company, but it actually turned out it was all the directors and their legal advisors. So these guys come in and there's a solicitor sitting there ready to write down everything you say. You're probably going to get a very brief sort of debriefing in that sort of environment. It's not going to be constructive, and particularly the more you get into public sector. And I know from, like, talk with some public sector people who are at the front line, and they're actually afraid of this sort of debriefing. Whereas debriefing really should be a great opportunity for a supplier to come in and actually learn a bit more and be able to come back stronger the next time. We all know that's the theory, but in reality, with standstill notices and standstill periods for public sector contracts, public sector procurement people are often fearful of that debriefing environment. Coordinate your response. This is another very simple little thing. We've often run competitions in the Gwinty tenders, and we've had 5 respondents from the one party, and each of them doesn't know that the other party is sort of leading a bid, and the sales guy is, and the head of sales is, and some director is, and somebody else from an administrative perspective is as well. So just coordinate your responses. And the last one there is to register with the likes of e-tenders or any other party that's actually aggregating public sector type of requirements and contracts and putting them out there in the marketplace, so that you're registered and you're getting sort of proactively notified about opportunities. We frequently get people come in and say, I can do such a thing, and I say, well, we ran a competition for that 3 or 4 months ago, and we never heard, you never put your hand up, oh, I didn't see the public ad. So most of that 10 billion euro spend is publicly advertised, and so you will be able to find it if you're looking for it. So I'm not sure how I am time-wise.
3 minutes.
3 minutes. Well, look, I tried to summarise it into 10 key points. Some of them are very practical, and hopefully it'll help. It's very hard for me to go and sit on the other side of the table and see how would I try to get around me, but there's a few little thoughts that hopefully help.